Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding it in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Dalid and Mirtz Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Kuf Tzadik Zayin Amid Beis. A little bit of a complicated share today, the beginning of it. After that it gets a little bit simpler, but let's get to it. So our learning today should be Uschus for Achenu K'beis Yisrael Hanesunim Atzara B'Ashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam U'Bein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oira Mishibur L'Geula Hashta B'Gala U'Vizban Kariv V'Neimar Amen. Our learning should be Uschus for Shalema for Esther Fradl Bas Chana Moshemer Ben Esther Fradl Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Rivka Bas Shir Aleah Chava Hadassah Bas Serel Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana Gila Shifra Bas Ilan Udel. They should all have a refuah shalema b'say shar chayil Yisrael. We are mispal that b'schus the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. I want to mention before we get into the shir that that's a line that I've been saying a lot. I've been saying it now for a very long time at the beginning of the Mishnah Berurah shir that we're mispal that the schus of limud HaTorah, the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael. I think there's something important to mention, and that is, Baruch Hashem, we have a tremendous amount of limud Torah going on nowadays. Really, I can't say that it's unprecedented, but the amount of Torah learning that's going on nowadays, Daf Yomi and Dirshu and Amid Yomi and Kinyan Masechta and Oraisa and art scroll in Hebrew and in English and videos and everything else. There's so much limud HaTorah going on. It's really unbelievable. But I want to caution, especially nowadays where you see a tremendous increase, unfortunately, in anti-Semitism. A little bit frightening. And I want to mention that we have the Chazal that tell us that one of the things that led to the Churban Bayis was Al Asher Lo Berchu B'Torah Tefillah, that they didn't say Berchas HaTorah. Now, note, the Chazal doesn't say that the Churban came Asher Lo Lamad Torah. It doesn't say that they weren't learning Torah. It's apparent that they were learning Torah. The problem was Al Asher Lo Berchu B'Torah Tefillah. They learned Torah, but they didn't make Berchas HaTorah. Whether it means that they didn't make Berchas HaTorah at all, or does it mean that they made Berchas HaTorah, but they just misanashim ulamada, they didn't pay any attention to it, they just rattled it off as a part of davening. I think part of the lesson of that Ma'amar Chazal, what does it mean when somebody learns Torah, but lo berchu b'Torah tefillah? I think it means that there was a lot of Torah learning going on, but the Torah learning was absent of Kedusha. People could learn Torah for lots of reasons. People could learn Torah for social reasons. It gives them a social network. They go to a share and they have friends. Maybe they serve good food. One Maggid Shir told me a few years ago, I was surprised that he was managing to bring out a significant olam to a certain type of share, and I asked him, what's the secret? He said, sushi. So okay, so they're learning Torah for sushi and they're learning Torah for the social circle. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's halavai that people should come out to a share, but you want it to be mitay shaloi l'shma ba l'shma. You want to get them out to the share, maybe with the sushi, but then you want to raise them up, and if you want to get to the point of Torah l'shma, you want to get to a point where the Torah is being learnt because this is Torah Hashem. And we're learning it because the Torah Kedosha says V'gisa b'yom v'layla, because we want to learn Das Elyon, because we want to be more connected to Kutcha Brichu, because we want to become more Kadosh. The limud HaTorah has to be infused with Kedusha, and it has to come from a place of Kedusha. It can't just be because it's entertaining. It can't just be because it makes me part of a real exciting crowd, and again, that could be a stepping stone. But we need limud HaTorah l'shma. We need limud HaTorah with kedusha. We need limud HaTorah that raises people up, that makes people better people. It makes them Yirei Shamayim. It increases their shmiras HaMitzvahs and shmiras HaTorah. That's what we need, and we're mispal that is what should cause the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. Okay, now that I got off my soapbox, we could continue with our Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. Daf Kuf Tzadik Zayin Amud Aleph Siman Shin Mem Hey Sif Ches. The last words on Kuf Tzadik Zayin Amud Aleph says the Mechaber. So before we read the words of the Mechaber, let's just remember what we've learned so far. We've learned the requirements of a Rishus Harabim. In order for something, for a place to be considered a Rishus Harabim, so the Mechaber told us, Ezehu Rishus Harabim. What's a Rishus Harabim? Rechovos ushvakim, streets, market squares, town squares that are more than 16 amos wide. So we have requirement number one is a size requirement. It's got to be more than 16 amos wide. So you're looking at a street, you want to know, is this street a Rishus Harabim? Is it a bona fide daraisa Rishus Harabim? Well, you got to know the dimensions. Is it 16 amos wide? In order to be a Rishus Harabim, it's got to be 16 amos wide. We had prerequisite number 2, which was a nom mikayrib. It cannot be roofed over. If it's got a roof, it can't be a Rishus Harabim. So you want it to be a Rishus Harabim, it's got to be 16 amos wide. It cannot be roofed over. Requirement number 3, ein lahem chayma. It cannot be walled in. If it's walled in, then it cannot be a Rishus Harabim. We had a carve out. We learned in the previous year, sometimes you could have a wall and it could still be a Rishus Harabim, right? If it cuts straight through the city and it goes gate to gate, north to south, and the gates are open and they remain open all the time, then it's still a Rishus Harabim. We had, finally, a potential requirement number 4. We saw this major machlokes that some shittas hold, in order to be a Rishus Harabim, the street has to serve 600,000 people. It has to serve Shisha Ribu. If it doesn't serve Shisha Ribu, it can't be a Rishus Harabim. So that's what we learned so far. Now comes along the Mechaber, and the Mechaber says like this. Mivuos. We have a mavui. Now, we're going to talk a lot about mivuyos in Eruvin, and there's kind of what we view as the classic mavui, especially we're learning Daf Yomi and we're learning Eruvin, there's a classic mavui. Now the classic mavui is an alleyway, but it's got walls, either on 3 sides or at least on 2 sides. A mavui mefulish is an open mavui, it has walls on 2 sides. A mavui she'ena mefulish, a mavui mefulish is open, it only has walls on 2 sides. A mavui she'ena mefulish, if it's a closed mavui, it has walls on 3 sides. I don't believe that this word mavuos over here is referring to that. We're not talking about a walled alleyway. I want to take the question of mechitzos out of the equation. Nobody here makes any reference to mechitzos. Not the Mechaber, not the Mishnah Berurah, not the Bir Halacha. Nobody is making any reference to mechitzos over here. So the word mavuos over here, you could, in your mind, you could take it out and you could use the word rechovos, streets, instead of the word mavuos. So mavuos, you have a street, harechavim sheish esrei ama, that is 16 amos wide. So if we pause here for a second, we're looking at a street. The street is 16 amos wide. No walls, no roof. Okay, it's a Rishus Harabim. Let's go now, according to the Shittas, that you don't need 600,000 people. So fine. So this is a Rishus Harabim. It's a street. It's used for the Rabbim. It's 16 amos wide, no roof, no mechitzas. So far, this is very simple. You have a Rishus Harabim. But now comes the complication in the case. Says the Mechaber, umiskatzrim biktsasan. But part of the street narrows down. Now, I'm going to show you diagrams later on. We'll have to see the Mishnah Berurah first. But right now, let's keep it simple. You have a street that looks like it should be a Rishus Harabim. It's 16 amos wide, it's not roofed over, there's no mechitzas. Fine, it's a Rishus Harabim. But now, umiskatzrin biktsasan, part of the street narrows down. So maybe it narrows from 16 amos wide to 10 amos wide. Okay, now we have to be very careful how we read the Mechaber, because the Mishnah Berurah makes a textual emendation over here. And I'm going to read this Mechaber according to the way the Mishnah Berurah says it should be read. So the Mishnah Berurah says like this. So far, we're going to have 2 cases here in the Mechaber. This is case number 1. Case number 1 is Bavoy Sarichavim Sheish Esrei Ama, a street that's 16 amos wide, umiskatzrim biktsasan, but part of it narrows down. Okay, case number 1. Now we're going to insert the word oy. You see it says ve'ein. Take out that vav, and we're going to put in the word oy. Oy, or next case. What's the next case? She'ein bahem sheish esrei ama. You have a street that is not 16 amas wide. Okay, so far, a street that's not 16 amas wide is not a Rishus Harabim, right? Doesn't make the bar. It's not 16 amas wide. It's not a Rishus Harabim. Now, skip a few words in the Mechaber, and you see two words off the end of the line, the word arkan. So we're going to take the vav that we took off the word ve'ein, and we're going to attach it to arkan, and we're going to turn it to ve'arkan. So now you have a street that's not 16 amas wide, but ve'arkan, the length of this street, is la'orik Rishus Harabim. It flows into and along the length of Rishus Harabim. So now, again, the way I am reading the Mechaber, following the emendation of the Mishnah Berurah, we have two separate cases over here. Case number one, you have a street that is 16 amas wide. Okay, no problem, Rishus Harabim. But it narrows down at some point to 12 amas. Okay, fine, that's case number one. So what do we do now? We have a 16 amma part of the street, sounds like Rishus Harabim. We have a 12 amma part of the street, sounds like not a Rishus Harabim, right? Maybe a Carmelist, but not a Rishus Harabim. That's case number one. Case number two, we have a street that is not 16 amas wide. We have a street, it's 10 amas wide. But this street is aligned with the length of Rishus Harabim. What do those words mean? What those words mean is that the street runs into the Rishus Harabim, or the Rishus Harabim runs into the street. So you have a nice big Rishus Harabim, maybe it's 20 amas wide. You have a Rishus Harabim, and then the Rishus Harabim ends, and it terminates at the opening of a narrow street. But the length of the narrow street is aligned, and it's really a continuation of the length of the nice big Rishus Harabim. In both of those cases, says the Mechaber, Yesh Oimrim Shehem Rishus Harabim. There are those that say that both of those are a Rishus Harabim. So I read to you the Mechaber. I basically translated it to you. Now we're going to see the Mishnah Berurah, and we'll see Biur Halacha where this halacha is coming from, and then I'll show you diagrams. But let's get to it. Says the Mishnah Berurah as follows. Mishnah Berurah is kan chafei biktsasan. First of all, says the Mishnah Berurah, we have to make a textual emendation. Ta'as Sefer. There's a Ta'as Sefer over here. V'tzarech loymar, and the Mechaber is supposed to say as follows. Mevuos shehem, mevuos harechavim sheish esrei amma, streets that are 16 amas wide, umiskatzrin biktsasan, but part of it becomes narrow. That's case number one. Or case number two, she'ein behem sheish esrei amma, you have a street that is not 16 amas. Not at any point. It's not 16 amas. But the arkan la'orech Rishus Harabim, the length of this street runs with the length of the Rishus Harabim. Yesh Oimrim Shem Rishus Harabim. There's a Yesh Oimrim, aka the Rashba, who says that these are considered a Rishus Harabim. Okay, we did the textual emendation. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ubiur hadvarim hu. The explanation of this is as follows. Dimitri Kasav. First, the Mechaber is writing Le'inyan Mavoi Shemiskatzer b'miktsasai. He's talking about a street where part of the street becomes narrow. That's case number one. Case number one is where part of the street becomes narrow. And then he adds on another case. No, it's not a street that is 16 amas and part of it narrows down to 12. That's case number one. Case number two is at no point is this street 16 amas. This is a 10 amma wide street. At no point does this street become 16 amas. Nevertheless, since the length of this street flows together with the length of the Rishus Harabim, and it opens into the Rishus HaRabim, v'Rabim boikim boi, and the tzibor, the Rabim, the public, they flow from the Rishus HaRabim into this street directly. It feeds mamish into it. Harehu kechelik mimenu. This street, which is only 10 amos wide, becomes part of the 16 amma wide Rishus HaRabim, and it has a din of Rishus HaRabim. Va'ayin be'biur halacha. And he says, take a look at the biur halacha. So, first I want to show you a picture. Well, actually, I'm not going to show you a picture first. First, we're going to take a look at the biur halacha. Let's take it to biur halacha. Let me just find where it is. Okay, take a look at biur halacha dibra maschil umiskatzrin biktsasa. Says the Chavetz Chaim, ayin Mishnah Berurah sivkat and chafei. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah chafei that I just read. B'mashe kasavnu, where I wrote, da'afilu im ein b'chal meshech hamavui, that the second case is where at no point is the street 16 amos wide. Says the Chavetz Chaim, din ze noiveya mimagid Mishnah. This halacha that and the explanation that I'm giving you of Sivches flows from the Magid Mishnah, b'shem harashba ba'avodas hakodesh, who's quoting the Rashba in the Rashba Sefer Avodas HaKodesh. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here that the Mechaber is giving us two separate cases. Now, the challenge over here is that if the Mishnah Berurah is telling me that the Mechaber gives me two separate cases, then I have to understand not only what the two different cases are, but l'chayra I have to understand why I am being given two different cases. Usually when you have different cases, case one is based on one halacha or one chidush, one novelty. Case two has an additional novelty, right? That's why you have two cases. But over here, from a simple reading of the words, it's kind of hard to see what exactly the two different novelties are. Because the truth is, if you start reading this very, very simply, I made a few different pictures over here. Let me go Mikal El HaKaved. 1 second. Okay. Let's imagine that this over here is the first case that the Mishnah Berurah tells us the Mechaber is talking about. You could see that over here, I've got a mavui that is 16 amos wide. So you've got a nice street over here. These boxes on each side are supposed to be houses. So you've got a nice residential street, but it happens to be 16 amos wide. Okay, so you look at this mavui and you say, well, I went to the Dirshu share. It's a street, and it's 16 amos wide, and it's not makura, it's not roofed over, there's no mechitzas. Okay, Rishus HaRabim. Now the street narrows down, and over here on this side of the street, maybe this is the cul-de-sac where the fancy people live. You see, these houses are bigger than these houses. Over here, the street is only 10 amos wide. So now the question is, what do I do with this street? It's only 10 amos wide. So is it pshat that this is a Rishus HaRabim and this is not a Rishus HaRabim? Because this is 16 amos wide and this is not 10 amos wide? Kamash Malon, the Mechaber, that no, you should know this is what the Mechaber means. Mavui, that's Rechavim Sheish Esrayama. A Mavui is 16 amos wide. Umiskatzrin B'ktsasan, and it narrows down at part of it to only 10 amos wide. Yesh Omrim, that it's a Rishus HaRabim. Why would it be a Rishus HaRabim? Well, you might look at it, you might say, come on, it's all part of the same street. If this is a Rishus HaRabim, what, this is a Rishus HaYachid? On the other hand, yeah, why not? This part of it meets the bar of Rishus HaRabim, this part of it does not meet the bar of Rishus HaRabim. Why would that be such a Chiddush La'alacha? It doesn't sound like such a stretch, right? But okay, so the Mechaber is telling us you should know this is a Rishus HaRabim. So let's imagine that that's case number one. Okay. Now what's case number two? Case number 2, well, if you read the Mishnah Berurah, what's case number 2? V'achakach hoisif oid, then the Mechaber adds on, even if no part of the mavli is 16 amos wide. Okay, well, I mean, if you're talking about a 10 amma wide street in a vacuum, in isolation, there's nothing to make it a Rishus HaRabim. It's only 10 amos wide, right? None of it is 16 amos wide. Nevertheless, since the length of this non-16 amma wide mavli is aligned with the length of Rishus HaRabim, so that the Rabbim walks right into it, now if I'm going to draw that diagram, how am I going to draw that diagram? I'm going to draw it like this. I'm going to draw a nice big Rishus HaRabim, 16 amos wide, and then I'm going to draw a 10 amma wide street. Now, if you notice, if I put these two pictures next to each other, they are identical, right? Is there any difference between these two pictures? The only difference would seem to be semantics. In the top picture, I'm calling the wide part a mavui, that's 16 amos wide, and I'm calling the narrow part an extension of the mavui, that's only 10 amos wide, and I'm telling you a halacha, well, yeah, even though the mavui narrowed down, since part of it is 16 amos, the whole thing becomes a Rishus HaRabim. Okay, and in this picture? Okay, in this picture, I'm calling the wide part of Rishus HaRabim, and I'm calling the narrow part of mavui. But they're the same. They're the same case. So if that's pshat in this Mishnah Berurah, then l'chayra we have a problem. The answer, Rabbi Yisai, is that that's not pshat in this. There's two parts to the answer. Part number one to the answer is that I don't believe that that's pshat in the Mishnah Berurah. Part number two of the answer is what we just saw in this Biur Halacha, which is that this halacha flows from a Rashba. It flows from a Rashba brought by the Maggid Mishnah. Once you take a look at the Maggid Mishnah and you see the way the Maggid Mishnah quotes the Rashba, everything comes a little bit into sharper focus. So let's take a look and let's read the actual words of the Rashba. The Rashba says as follows. V'harashba zal kosav. The Rashba writes, Mevuos harechavim tes zayin amma. Streets that are 16 amos wide. Afal pisha miktsasan miskatzrin. Even though part of the street narrows down. Ve'ein boy tes zayin amma. And it doesn't have 16 amos. Harei ze Rishus HaRabim. That is a Rishus HaRabim. Why, says the Rashba? He explains himself. She'i efsher l'Rishus HaRabim lehislaket b'malaket. Because it's not possible to cut a Rishus HaRabim with a razor. Now, I've seen different pshatim in the Achronim exactly how to understand that phrase of the Rashbas, that you can't cut a Rishus HaRabim with a scissor or with a razor. But the bottom line that comes out of everything is that this is pshat in the first case that the Rashba is talking about. The first case of the Rashba is, you have a mavui. In this beautiful mavui, I just didn't make houses. Imagine there are houses on both sides. Here you have a mavui. Over here the mavui is 16 amos wide. Over here the mavui is 16 amos wide. But in the middle, the mavui narrows down a little. Over here, the mavui is only 12 amos wide. So what are we going to say? We're going to say, oh, this is a Rishus HaRabim, this is a Rishus HaRabim, this is a Carmelis. And that would be a very interesting halacha, by the way, because, you know, here you have a Rishus D'Rabbanan that's sandwiched between two Rishuyos D'Oraisa, you know. But, says the Rashba, can't be. It can't be that this is a Rishus HaRabim, and this is a Rishus HaRabim, and this is a Carmelis, all along the same street. Why? Because Yefshel Rishus HaRabim l'hislakit b'malakit. Because you can't cut up a Rishus HaRabim with a scissor. Two ways to understand that. One way to understand it is, you can't take a scissor and make a snip over here and say that this is Rishus HaRabim, and then say that this is a Rishus D'Rabbanan of a Carmelis, make a snip over here, and say, oh, this is a Rishus Harabim again. So Rishus Harabim, Carmelis, Rishus Harabim, and then if it narrows down again over here, it's going to be another Carmelis. It's all one street. So make up your mind. Is it a Rishus Harabim or is it not a Rishus Harabim? And the same public that's using this part of the Rishus Harabim is using this part of the Rishus Harabim and is using this part of the Rishus Harabim because that's the way they're walking through. So says the Rashba, what? We're going to start taking a scissor, we're going to start taking out measuring sticks and measure every single part of the Rishus Harabim and start cutting it up into pieces? Doesn't make any sense. It's not logical in any way. The street is used the same way. It's all part of the same street. Another pshat that they say is when they make Rishus Harabim, nowadays they come with lasers and they come with fancy surveying equipment and everything else, and they lay out the lines. Back in the day, they didn't cut a Rishus Harabim with a razor blade. It wasn't typical that the Rishus Harabim had a uniform width throughout. But if it's a major thoroughfare that for the most part has a width of 16 amas, it's a Rishus Harabim. In one place it narrowed down. Maybe there was an obstacle in the way. I don't know. But in one place it narrowed down a little bit to 14 amas. Now you're going to tell me, oh, no, that part, not a Rishus Harabim. No, Rashba says, can't be. So that's case number one over here. Case number one of the Mechaber is Mevuais Harechavim Sheish Esrayama, a street that is 16 amas wide, umiskatzrin biktsasan, but it narrows in a little area. Okay, that's going to be a Rishus Harabim. That's case number one. What's case number two? Well, for case number two, let's go back to the Rashba, and first let's understand if indeed case number two has to be so very different than case number one. And there's a hint to that in the words of the Rashba. The Rashba gives us case number one, and then the Rashba says as follows. Lefikach, since I told you the halacha of case number one, that even though part of the Rishus Harabim becomes narrow, it's still considered a Rishus Harabim, lefikach, therefore, you should know another halacha. Mevuais hamefulashin l'Rishus Harabim. When you have a street that is opened to Rishus Harabim, the arkan la'orich Rishus Harabim, and it runs with the Rishus Harabim, the length of this street runs in the same direction as the length of the Rishus Harabim. Not only in the same direction, it's not parallel, it's an extension of the Rishus Harabim. The length, the words I would use in English are the arkan la'orich Rishus Harabim. The length of this mavli, the length of this street is la'orich Rishus Harabim. It's a continuation and an extension of the Rishus Harabim. Says the Rashba, even though this mavli is not 16 amas wide, Harein Rishus Harabim Gemurim, it is absolutely a bona fide Rishus Harabim. Case number two, and I showed you this picture before, this is case number two. Case number two, says the Rashba, is, I told you, if you have a Rishus Harabim that is 16 amas wide, but somewhere in the middle it gets narrow, and it narrows down for some area. It narrows down to, let's say, 14 amas, and then it widens again back to 16 amas like this. I told you that even the narrow part is a Rishus Harabim. What flows out of that halacha, once you understand this halacha, and you understand that it's possible to have a section of a Rishus Harabim that is not 16 amas wide, and it's still a Rishus Harabim, what flows out of that is this halacha. This halacha is a little different. This halacha is you have a major thoroughfare that is 16 amas wide. But you know what happens? Like a lot of streets, in my mind, I think I'm basing this, though, on outdated facts. I'm remembering years ago when you took Route 9 into Lakewood. So Route 9 was this big, wide Route 9. And then when you came from Howell into Lakewood, it suddenly narrowed down and it became much more residential. So if you have, now over there it's a lot more than 16 amas. I'm not saying the measurements don't jive. I'm not saying that the halachas over here are pertinent to Route 9. I'm just giving it as an example. You have a nice big Rishus Harabim over here, and it terminates. The highway ends. The big Rishus Harabim ends, but it terminates at a street. Nice residential street that's only 10 amas wide. This 10 amas street is going to be a Rishus Harabim. You know why? Because it's an extension of the Rishus Harabim. It's an extension of the Rishus Harabim, and everybody who's coming from this Rishus Harabim is just continuing on walking into the street. So this street is now going to be a Rishus Harabim. Now, again, you might look at it, you might say that this halacha is not so different than the first halacha. But now that you see it inside in the Rishus Harabim, you understand that inside of the Rashba, you understand that the Rashba wasn't coming to say two different halachas. Adarabba, the Rashba was coming to say one halacha. He says lefikach. It's therefore. He's just saying once you understand this halacha, which gives you the precedent that you can have a section of a Rishus Harabim that is not 16 amas wide, that leads you to understand this halacha. That when you see this, and maybe this was common where the Rashba lived, when you see such a thing where you have a major thoroughfare, a major Rishus Harabim, 16 amas wide, and it terminates in a street, no part of this street is 16 amas wide. This is not like the other case. In this case, it's all one Rishus Harabim. You want to give it a name? Call it Route 9. It's all part of Route 9. But in one area, Route 9 narrowed down. That's not what's happening over here. This is not all Route 9. This is Route 9, and then it terminates, and it ends in a nice residential street. But that nice residential street, even though it's only 10 amas wide, is going to have a din of Rishus Harabim because it is a natural extension of the Rishus Harabim. Now, just to add another wrinkle to this, if you take a look in Biur Halacha, same one, I believe. Yeah. Umiskatzrin B'Ktsason. The Mishnah Berurah adds another, the Chavetz Chaim adds another wrinkle here. In this second case, the way I gave you the second case, this is the nice, beautiful, big 16 amma wide Rishus Harabim. It terminates in a street. What happens down here? Where does the street go now? You can imagine different scenarios. Maybe the street continues on and it curves around, and then it makes a right turn. Maybe two other streets open off it, but it's going now into a nice little residential neighborhood. And all of the streets that it's going to are not 16 amas wide. Or maybe this goes for a few blocks, and then it gets wide again, and it becomes the Rishus Harabim again. Does that change the halacha? Well, says the Biur Halacha, the Mechaber doesn't say that in order for case number 2 to be considered a Rishus Harabim, it has to eventually get wide again. He doesn't say that. It sounds like the way I explained it to you. It was a nice big 16 amma wide highway, and then it terminated in a street. The street is only 10 amas. I don't care what happens down the road. I don't care if it never gets 16 amas wide again. It doesn't matter. It's a natural extension of the Rishus Harabim, therefore it's a Rishus Harabim. Aval medivra Tosfos, and interestingly enough, the Harashba b'chidushav, and the Rashba in the Chidushei Harashba, u'sha'ari paiskim she'eviu b'shem ri, mashba d'loyev Rishus Harabim elim ken amavi mufolish b'shtei tzadim l'Rishus Harabim v'chein heter ha'mechaber b'siftes. Sounds like from these Rishonim that in case number 2, the narrow part, the 10 amma wide part, is only a Rishus Harabim if eventually it widens up again to a Rishus Harabim. Now, if that's true, then again, this second case is really the first case. Again, it's just getting wide again. Okay, that really concludes the really rough part of today's daf. Let's go a little bit weiter. So now we go back into Mishnah Berurah. We're almost at the end of this Mishnah Berurah, where the Mishnah Berurah says, Umidaloi. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Umidaloi pirish ha-mechaber shi'ura. If you notice that nowhere in this discussion did the Mechaber mention how narrow the street got. He said that the street was 16 amas and then it narrowed down. Does it matter how far it narrows down? What if it was 16 amas and it narrowed down to 2 amas? Is that 2 amma part still going to be Rishus HaRabim? Because it's part of this larger 16 amma wide street? Says the Mishnah Berurah, for the fact that the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber, doesn't mention a size, mashma, the implication is that even if it gets very narrow, and he qualifies that a little bit, it's not even 13 amas wide. We'll see what the significance of that number is soon. The implication on the Mechaber is, I don't care how narrow it gets. Now, in the Sharetzion, the Chavetz Chaim qualifies that a little bit. In Sharetzion, his Chav test, the Chavetz Chaim says, even if it only narrows down to 10 amas. The implication of the Chavetz Chaim is, we're not going to have this conversation if it narrows down to 2 amas. We're having this conversation even if it narrows down to 10 amas. But, I mean, if it peters out somewhere in the middle, at some point we're going to say, no, the Rishus HaRabim is gone. We're not going to say, yeah, it's like the Rashba said, EF shel Rishus HaRabim lehislaket b'malakate. It got a little bit narrow, it got wide again. Yeah, if it was 16 amas wide, then it went down to 2 amas, it's not a street anymore. It's not a Mokum L'Hiluch HaRabim at 2 amas. 10 amas could still be a Mokum L'Hiluch HaRabim. So, okay, if it got 10 amas, we're still going to call the 10 amas section a Rishus HaRabim. Okay. Now we go from Sif Ches to Sif Tes. Now, we're going to break our teeth, because when we read Sif Tes is going to seem to fly a little bit in the face of Sif Ches. And the answer is going to be that the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that yes, indeed, Sif Tes does fly in the face of Sif Ches. Why? Because Sif Ches is the Shitas Harashba and the Magen Mishnah, and Sif Tes is the Shitas Harash. So, yeah, Sif Ches and Sif Tes don't live on the same planet. So let's take a look at Sif Tes. You'll ask me, why did the Mechaber write it that way? The Chavetz Chaim also says it's a little bit funny that the Mechaber wrote it this way. Having said that, let's see what the Mechaber says in Sif Tes. Mavois harachavim shloish esrei amos ushlish. A mavoi that is 13 and a third amos wide. Ushnei rashehem mefulashim l'rishus harabim shu rachav sheish esrei. And the 2 sides of this street each open up onto a 16 amma wide Rishus HaRabim. Yesh Omrim Shu Rishus HaRabim. There are those that say that it's a Rishus HaRabim. Fascinating. What did the Mechaber just describe? I mean, the Mechaber just said, if you have a Rishus HaRabim, if you have a Mavli that's 13 and a third amas wide, right? This street here in the middle, right? I wrote 12. But let's imagine this was 13 and a third. If you have a street over here that's 13 and a third amas wide, but it's foolish to Rishus HaRabim on 2 ends. Okay. It hits a Rishus HaRabim 16 amas wide on this end, and it hits a Rishus HaRabim 16 amas wide on this end. Guess what? Yesh Omrim Shu Rishus HaRabim. There are those that say that it's a Rishus HaRabim. Well, in Sif Ches we said more than that. In Sif Ches, especially after the Mishnah Berurah that we just read, in Sif Ches, basically we said that if you would have a street over here in the middle that's only 10 amas wide, and it hits a Rishus HaRabim that's 16 amas wide on this side, and a Rishus HaRabim that's 16 amas wide on this side, it's a Rishus HaRabim. So now comes along Sif Tes to tell us, if the middle street is 13 and a third amas wide, it's a Rishus HaRabim. What is going on here? Well, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's called Chafav, Shloish Esrei Amas Ushlish. You know what? Maybe we should take a look. Yeah, let's take a look at the Biur Halacha first. Biur Halacha Dibur Hamaskel Shloish Esrei Amas Ushlish. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you should know. The Iker Siv Zeh Nichlal B'Hoda Le'el B'Siv Ches. I mean, we just had this in Sif Ches. Adarabah, Sif Tes seems to be cutting back on what Sif Ches said. Sif Ches didn't give a measurement, and the Mishnah Berurah said even 10 amas. Sif Tes is expanding it. It has to be 13 and a third amas. What's going on? Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Chavetz Chaim in the Biur Halacha, the Chilkoi HaMechaber The Mechaber made two seifim out of this. Mishum de Siv Ches v'Lashon HaMagid Mishnah b'Shem HaRashba b'Avodas HaKodesh. Siv Ches is the Shittas HaRashba. V'Siv Zeh Lashon HaRosh b'Shem HaRi. Siv Tes is the Shittas HaRosh in the name of the Ri. U'be'emes pligei adadi. And Siv Ches and Siv Tes don't live in the same world. Siv Ches and Siv Tes are arguing on each other. The Lodei Rishayna, according to the Rashba, heavy Rishos HaRabim afilu b'pachas b'shloish esrei. In the Shittas HaRashba, in the world of Siv Ches, even if the middle street is only 10 amos wide, it's a Rishos HaRabim. And in the Uladei Azu, skipping the brackets, Uladei Azu Darash, and in Siv Tes, the Shittas HaRosh, mashma d'davka b'shloish esrei. It's only if it's 13 and a third amos wide that it's going to be a Rishos HaRabim. And the Gra says, yeah, Siv Ches and Siv Tes are arguing with each other. And says the Chavetz Chaim, Ulepella, K'tzas ala Mechaber. The Mechaber is a shtickle of Pella over here. Shalaik Sava M'Siv Echad B'Lasha Plukta. Really, Siv Ches and Siv Tes should have been one Siv, and it should have said, the Eish Oimrim. It should have said that there's a machlokes here. Instead, we have two seifim. It doesn't point out that it's a machlokes, but guess what? It is a machlokes. Now let's see the Mishnah Berurah inside. It says the Mishnah Berurah is Kol Chafav Shloish Esrei Amos Ushlish. What is the significance of this number? 13 and a third. Shloish Esrei Amos Ushlish. Svira Lahu, this sheet of the Rosh holds. The Bashir Zeh, this measurement of 13 and a third Amos, Gam Kein Nicha Tashmishte L'Rabim K'tzas. 13 and a third Amos is wide enough to be a useful public street. Umahani, and it's wide enough, the share of Rishos HaRabim is 16 Amos. But 13 and a third is wide enough that it will make it a Rishos HaRabim, Kishishne Roshem Ufuloshin Rishos HaRabim, if on two sides it's got a Rishos HaRabim, Sheyischashiv Gam Mokem Zel Rishos HaRabim, so that the middle part is considered an extension of the Rishos HaRabim, Va'ayin Bir Alacha, where Siv Tes does not drive with Siv Ches. There are those that say that the middle piece will still be considered a Rishos HaRabim. Now, the logic that the Mishnah Berurah is going to give now, I think, could be applied to Siv Ches as well. Again, let's realize, Siv Ches, the Rashba, Siv Tes, the Rosh, both essentially, at least in case number one of Siv Ches, addressing the same Metzias. 16 amos wide, narrow part, 16 amos wide. In the world of the Rashba, I don't care how narrow the narrow part gets, even if it's 10 amos wide, the narrow part is still Rishos HaRabim. The world of the Rosh, the middle part has to be 13 and a third amos wide. But in the world of the Rashba, the middle part, the narrow part, is a Rishos HaRabim. In the world of the Rosh, the middle part is a Rishos HaRabim if it's 13 and a third amos wide. Why? What's the logic? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the logic. The Kavan, the Rishos HaRabim, Gemura Yesh B'Shnei Rosheh, since there's a Rishos HaRabim on both sides, Ubaykin Bar Rabim, and the Rabim passes through the narrow area, Umahalchin Me Rishos HaRabim Derech HaMavli, and they go through from one end, the 16 Amma Rishos HaRabim on one side, and the 16 Amma wide Rishos HaRabim on the other side. They continue through the narrower Mavli. Nimtza de have a Tashmish the Rabim Gabazuya Mavli. So they're using the 10 Amma narrow Mavli in the middle as a Rishos HaRabim, the Choshev Rishos HaRabim Atzma. Now, he brings down that L'chayra, at first glance, there's a shtickle steerer to this in Siman Shin Samach Daled, and he's going to describe the stira and explain why it's not a stira. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'hadam avur l'kamam b'Siman Shin Samach Daled, this that we're going to learn later on in Siman Shin Samach Daled. That when you have a street that opens up on each end to a Rishos HaRabim, ein dinoi k'Rishos HaRabim. The street does not have a din of Rishos HaRabim. So again, we just finished saying over here in Siv Ches and in Siv Tes that if you have a big Rishos HaRabim and a big Rishos HaRabim and a narrow Mavui in the middle Mavui is a Rishos HaRabim by virtue of the two Rishos HaRabims on the side. Rashba kishitasai, Rosh kishitasai. But that's what we just said. Shin Samach Daled, we say not that way. In Shin Samach Daled, we say beferish. If you have a narrow street that opens up on each end to a Rishos HaRabim, the narrow street is not a Rishos HaRabim. Often a stira. How do we resolve the stira? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Very big difference. He gives two explanations. One explanation is a simple one. Well, we could say that Shin Samach Dalid is the Shitas Arush, and the narrow street is less than 13 and a third amas. So beautiful. Over here is Shitas Arush. It's 13 and a third amas wide, the narrow street. Shin Samach Dalid, Shitas Arush. It's not 13 and a third amas. You want to friend for the steer according to the Rashba? L'char, we could do that too. We could say over here we're talking about 10 amas. Over there in Shin Samach Dalid, we're talking about less than 10 amas. So you could resolve the steer that way. Or there's another nifty way to solve the stira. Or you could say, the Mairi, that in Shin Samach Dalid, we're talking about a different case. Or the Mairi kishamovi mufulish b'shteit stadin leroichav rishus harabim. Over here, we are talking about where the narrow street runs together with the length of the rishus harabim. Right? It's all an extension of the length of the rishus harabim. But let's say it does not do that. This diagram I didn't draw, but it should take all of 2 seconds to draw it if I have a clean paper. Here's a clean paper. Maybe pshat is like this in Shin Samach Daled. Maybe pshat in Shin Samach Daled is not that the narrow street runs with the length of the Rishus Harabim. Maybe Shin Samach Daled is talking about where the narrow street is perpendicular to 2 Rishus Harabims. Here I have 13th Avenue on top, 16 amas wide, 14th Avenue on the bottom, 16 amas wide, and 47th Street connecting the two of them only 10 amas wide. I'm making up those numbers, Rabbi Yisai. I'm just avenue, side street. That's Shin Samach Daled. Our Siman is it's an extension of the length. So if it's an extension of the length, in that case, the Rabbim just continues walking on the length of the Rishus Harabim and goes through the narrow street. In this case that I just drew, that's not what happens. If the Rabbim wants to turn onto the narrow street, they have to divert from one Rishus Harabim, go into a narrow street, and eventually come to the next Rishus Harabim. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says here. Oy de Mairi kishamovi mufolish b'shteit stadin leroichav Rishus Harabim. De ein Harabim boikin boi. De misha roitza lichtais be Rishus Harabim lemavali. If somebody wants to go from one Rishus Harabim to the mavali, hu tzarich la'akim darkoi. He has to make a turn. V'kan Mairi kishamovi holich la'oirech Rishus Harabim v'holchi derech mavali zu lahedya l'Rishus Harabim achar shekinegdoi v'lochein yesh shem Rishus Harabim gam al ha-mavali. I'm going to go weiter, even though we're going a little bit long, but in Erevin, we got to finish the page, because if we don't, we're going to start falling behind, and I don't want that to happen. So let's move along to Sif Yud, says the Mechaber. The rest is easy for today's page. Says the Mechaber. Kol davar shehu b'Rishus Harabim. Any elevation that is located in Rishus Harabim. So again, Rishus Harabim, 16 hours wide, not roofed over, no mechitzas, question of 600,000 aside, but now you're walking on the street and you're in a Rishus Harabim. Now sometimes along the way in Rishus Harabim, there could be things that are elevated off the ground in Rishus Harabim. Maybe you have a tree stump that's elevated. Maybe there's a step or something, but there's an elevation in the Rishus Harabim. What's the din of that elevation? Says the Mechaber. Kol davar shehu b'Rishus Harabim, anything that's located in the Rishus Harabim. Im eina gavoya shloisha tvachim. If it doesn't have an elevation of more than 3 tvachim off the ground, 11 to 12 inches. Afilu hein koitzim, even if it's a pile of thorns, oitzoya, or it's a mound of excrement, right? But it's 6 inches. So you have something making a little elevation in the Rishus Harabim. So you have a 6-inch tall mound of cow patties, or a pile of thorns. She'ein Rabbim darsin aleim. Now these are things that people aren't going to walk on. Nobody wants to step on thorns. Certainly nobody wants to step on the excrement, right? Still, chashuvim kekarka, they are bottled to the ground. They're bottled to the karka of Rishus Harabim, the heavy Rishus Harabim. So if you if you pick something up and you put it down on that pile, it's Rishus Harabim to Rishus Harabim. You didn't go from one kind of Rishus to another kind of Rishus. It's not considered an independent Rishus because it's less than 3 Tvachim off the ground. V'emu gavaya shleisha, but if it is 3 Tvachim elevated off the ground, so it's more than 11, 12 inches off the ground. It's 16 inches off the ground. It's 24 inches off the ground. Emu gavaya mishleisha, if it's more than 3 Tvachim off the ground, umishleisha ad tisha, it's somewhere between 3 Tvachim to almost 10 Tvachim. Right? It says here ad tisha. V'loi tisha b'klal, but not including the 9th tefach. In other words, not becoming 10 Tvachim. So then it depends what the nature of this elevation is. Imhu rachav al arba. If you have an elevation that's between 3 and 9 Tvachim tall, and on its surface it has the lateral dimensions of 4 Tvachim by 4 Tvachim, approximately 16 by 16 inches, heavy carmelis, then that elevation, the top of that elevation, is a Rishus D'Rabbanan. It is big enough to be Nechshav l'Rishus La'atzmai. It is Dalit al Dalit, and it could be considered an independent Rishus. But it's not 10 Tvachim tall, so it can't be a Rishus HaYachid. But it's not less than 3 Tvachim, so it's not part of the Rishus HaRabim. So what is it? It's a Carmelis. It's an independent Rishus. It's a Rishus D'Rabbanan. Have a Carmelis. Vim einoi rachav arba al arba. But if it doesn't have the lateral dimensions on its surface of 4 by 4, having mokum p'tur. So again, it's less than 4 by 4. So it can't be a Rishus La'atzma. It can't be its own independent Rishus because it's not Dalit al Dalit. But it can't be bottled completely to the Rishus HaRabim because it's more than 3 Tvachim elevated. But what is it? So what is it? It's a mokum p'tur. It's an exempt area. You could put things on it. You could take things off it. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is Kal Chavches. Afilohem kaitzim. T'chol pachas mishloisha. Anything that's less than 3 Tvachim elevated off the ground. Karmelon de'enich chalekes rishus la'atzma. It does not become its own rishus. Ubatal legabe rishus harabim. It is bottled to the karka of rishus harabim, and it is part of rishus harabim, even though people don't step on it. Doesn't matter. It's bottled to the rishus harabim. It's part of rishus harabim. Kaftes v'imu gavoya shloisha. But if it's more than 3 Tvachim elevated off the ground, the oz ein rabim yechoylin lidrais alav mitzad gavoy. Once it's more than 3 Tvachim elevated off the ground, it's not easy for people to step on it, Rabbi say. Right? Try to pick up and take a step 12 inches high. That's just not a regular part of walking. So that's not noyach tashmishte, and now it's no longer bottled to the karka of Rishus HaRabim. Nafka meklal Rishus HaRabim. Now it is taken out of the status of Rishus HaRabim. V'lechlal Rishus HaYachid loy ba ad gavay asar tvachim. But it ain't a Rishus HaYachid. To be a Rishus HaYachid, it's got to be 10 tvachim tall. V'nastu alei chachamim shem karmelis true Rishus la'atzmai. So the chachamim made it a Rishus D'Rabbanan. They made it a karmelis. Rach mol. It's a karmelis. It's this in-between type of Rishus. And therefore, also l'haitzi mimenu l'Rishus HaYachid l'Rishus HaRabim. So now, it's more than 3 Tvachim elevated off the ground. It's Dalit al Dalit. It's a Rishus La'atzmai, but only Rishus D'Rabbanan. So you can't take something from Rishus HaRabim and put it onto it. It would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. You can't take something off it into Rishus HaRabim. Issa D'Rabbanan. Ois kan lamid vim ein a rachav arba al arba. But if it's not 4 by 4, even if it's much longer than 4 Tvachim, so it has a length of 10 amas, but it's not rachav arba al arba, so it's not 4 by 4. It's 2 by 20 feet, but you don't have 4 by 4. You need at least dalid in both directions. Loy mitzarfinan zel rachba. The loy nech sheves rishus la'atzmai el imkain yesh by arba tvachim ba'arech va'arba b'roichav. In order to be its own rishus, you have to have 4 by 4. 4 if it's 2 by 30 amas, 2 by 100 amas. Doesn't matter. It's not going to be its own rishus because it's not dalid al dalid. We're going to break over here. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Shem should send Yeshua's refuas parnasa and shidduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kel Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu amen. Be well.